Good afternoon. It's Friday, the 8th of March 2019, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Mike Robinson, myself, Brian Gerrish, and we're delighted to have David Scott from Northern Exposure, and David, of course, reporting from north of the border in Scotland.
Right, look, we're going to get started off with GCMAF, and of course this was the product that was being produced by Immunotech over and was apparently able to help people with serious illnesses, including cancer. It ended up with David Noakes being put in prison for distributing what the MHRA called a medicine without a license. So he's been in prison, hopefully getting out soon on a tag. But in the meantime, his business partner, Lynn Thayer, has also been subject to pretty draconian treatment from the authorities. And she was Ian's guest on Humanity versus Ian Crane's guest on Humanity versus Insanity last night. So I just want to start off by looking at a brief clip from that.
The European arrest warrant has been issued to stop me working. Yeah, it's to stop the science and the discovery. They've come down very, very heavy-handed with me. You know, sorry, I'm just getting a bit emotional about this because I have to sign on every week for bail. I could not even go and see my father when he had to go to hospital because I had to sign on in a police station. You know, this is the control they got over me. I understood that the European arrest warrant was only valid for 60 days. I've now been 2 years. 2 years signing on for bail.
That observation you made about the 60 days is absolutely correct. Because if we go to the European Union website, this is European Justice. And this is from the relevant page. It says the European arrest warrant, an EAW, is a simplified cross-border judicial surrender procedure for the purpose of prosecuting or executing a custodial sentence or detention order. A warrant issued by one EU country's judicial authority is valid in the entire territory of the EU. And then it goes on to say that how it works. It's a request by a judicial authority in one EU country to arrest a person in another and surrender them for prosecution or to execute a custodial sentence or detention order issued in the first country. The mechanism is based on the principle of mutual recognition of judicial decisions. It's operational across all EU countries. But then here is the crucial element of this. It says, how is it different to a traditional extradition? And number one is strict time limits. The country where the person is arrested has to take a final decision on the execution of the European arrest warrant within 60 days after the arrest of the person.
So that seems pretty clear. Nonetheless, she has been subject to these bail conditions for 2 years. She's had this hanging over her head for 2 years. On Tuesday then, Lynn is required to attend the Royal Courts of Justice on the Strand in London. That's the Strand, London, WC2A2LL. Begins at 10 a.m. on Tuesday the 12th of March. And this is the extradition hearing finally taking place after 2 years. The European Union documentation says that this should have been completed within 2 months. So that alone has got to be seen as a miscarriage of justice. But Brian, ultimately, elsewhere in this interview, she said that as far as the UK authorities were concerned, she was not guilty of anything. No legal action has been taken against her in the UK. And yet she's subject to this process. It just seems like absolute intimidation.
Intimidation, Mike, but there's so many points here, aren't there? Because we could say how interesting that just at the point where Theresa May's government is delaying Brexit, one of the key subjects for getting away from the European Union, of course, is no common law. Completely different law system. You're essentially guilty until you're found innocent. Here we've got a British subject who is being held effectively under house arrest by the French. But is this appearing in the national press at all? Are the dangers of this appearing in the national press? No, they're not. So there are so many things which people in this country should be concerned about as to what is happening here. Perhaps David might like to comment, because of course north of the border we've got a resurgence of interest in the nation's law system of common law.
Yeah, David, welcome to the programme. Briefly, what are your thoughts on this?
There's a lot of things here which we're seeing parallels to in cases we're following in Scotland. The excessive time duration to make any decision, the waiving of the rules, and the strange justifications for holding people under draconian conditions. Sometimes it transpires to be something they've signed that then sort of gives the state the power to do this. But of course, they're signing things whilst being deceived about the purpose of the paperwork. So there's no full disclosure. The unlawfulness is everywhere.
Okay, well, you know, people may find this situation slightly hypocritical, bearing in mind the statement that Jeremy Hunt made this morning. So let's have a listen to that.
Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe is an innocent woman who spent the last 3 years in an Iranian jail, separated from her daughter Gabriella and her husband Richard. We've been working hard to secure her release, but despite repeated efforts, haven't been successful. We've not even been able to secure her the medical treatment she urgently needs, despite assurances to the contrary. So I have today decided that the UK will take a step that is extremely unusual and exercise diplomatic protection for Nazanin.
So he went on to talk about the fact that she'd been in prison for 3 years in Iran, separated from her family, as I say, refused medical treatment. You heard him say there, this is extremely unusual that they've decided to award diplomatic protection. He said that this now becomes a formal state issue, state-to-state issue. He said that Iran, there was lack of due process. And during the course of that statement that he made, which lasts about 2 minutes, he must have said that she was innocent about 24 times. So there's a bit of he doth protest too much, I think, there. But anyway, the point here is the hypocrisy of this situation with Zaghari-Ratcliffe compared to, for example, Lynn, or in fact to Melanie Shaw, is absolutely tangible, particularly where they're claiming that Zaghari-Ratcliffe not getting access to medical treatment while in prison. But let's just put this into a bit of context, because of course, why was Zaghari-Ratcliffe arrested and in fact convicted in the first place? Because Iran claims that she was involved in attempting to undermine the Iranian state through her work with Thomson Reuters Foundation. Now, of course, before she worked for Thomson Reuters Foundation, she worked for BBC Media Action as a project manager. And here is Juliet Harkin, formerly of BBC Media Action, saying, we, the BBC Media Action, worked in 2004 with individuals within the Syrian ministry who wanted change and tried to get them to be the drivers of that. She went on to say, all media development work that has been done in Syria has, in my opinion, been predicated upon the idea that there can be change from within. You have an authoritarian regime and you find who the reformers are within that and you work with them. So
that's destabilising the state.
Absolutely.
You are in a state, it's not your country, and you are actively working to destabilise it.
Absolutely, that is absolutely right. So Zaghari-Ratcliffe was working with BBC Media Action at one point. She went on to work with Thomson Reuters Foundation. And of course, what are they talking about? We believe accurate, independent media lead to better informed society. So they're playing the same game as BBC Media Action. And as you look through the information on their website, from photojournalism workshops to independent news agencies, we run programs on every continent tailored to real needs. And what's this about? It's about bringing Western narratives into countries where there might be a geopolitical agenda at work. And of course, they're training journalists with a Western perspective, using training courses which have a Western perspective. So let's just remind ourselves what the Foreign and Commonwealth Office said last year. This financial year, we're investing approximately £8 million in supporting public service and independent media. This includes projects in the Baltic states, Ukraine, as well as pan-regional initiatives. In addition, we're working with governments in the Baltic states alongside the British Council and other partners. And that includes Thomson Reuters Foundation, by the way, to address issues such as media literacy and societal integration. So, like I say, Zaghari Ratcliffe being presented as an aid worker, a charity worker, but the charities that she's been working for have been charities which, like BBC Media Action, Thomson Reuters Foundation, going into countries, retraining journalists and so on. And the question then is there a link between the Foreign Office work to do this and Thomson Reuters Foundation? Well, here's just one. We've mentioned this before. This is the WFD. On behalf of the United Kingdom, WFD recruits international election observers and leads the Commonwealth Partnership for Democracy, a UK initiative to support the political engagement of minorities and vulnerable groups in developing countries across the Commonwealth. But between 2008 and 2013, WFD led a partnership including UK Parliament, UK National Audit Office, the UK branch of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association and Thomson Reuters Foundation. The partnership helped establish parliamentary study centres in Lebanon, Uganda, Mozambique, a parliamentary public accounts committee in Morocco, freedom of information legislation in Ukraine and human rights committee in Uganda. So, you know, WFD, an independent, allegedly public body sponsored by the Foreign Office and UK Aid, and yet there's Mr. Bercow on the front, who of course is the Speaker of the House of Commons. So my question still is, what was Ms. Zaghari Ratcliffe doing? I'm not sure that it's as clear that she was as innocent as Jeremy Hunt claims, and of course we've got to remember that while Boris Johnson was Foreign Secretary, he didn't have quite the same view that she was quite as innocent as that. He said it afterwards, after he had made his mistake, which was to announce that, of course, that she was training journalists. So, you know, she may not have been witting in her training of journalists. She may not have quite understood what the
bigger picture was.
Well, exactly. Yeah. But it seems to me perhaps if she was a political pawn at that time, she's still being used as one.
Right, so let's follow that up with this recent statement which Iran has made, saying that the US is waging an economic and psychological war against Iran in an attempt to topple the government. So certainly Iran is taking matters very seriously at the moment. And could they be right on what they're saying? Well, of course, we had the gentleman in Parliament recently refusing to ask a question when he was asked if the British government was carrying out hybrid warfare, and that, of course, would include economic, psychological warfare. So we're not getting the truth out of the UK government. We're certainly not getting it out of the US government. But let's follow the pattern through. This is a headline. We've taken Russia today, but it's in other places. Israeli Navy ready to block Iranian oil exports in transit. And that's come from Netanyahu. Isn't that gentleman under a little bit of stress at the moment, Mike? A little bit of a tarnished track record, but he's still in a position to try and tell Iran what they should or should not be doing. But of course, what was picked up here very quickly was, can Israel do this? More on that in just a second. But Netanyahu said that Israel's prepared to throw the power of its naval force and urges the world to join in to block the Iranian oil shipments, circumventing unilaterally imposed US sanctions against Tehran. So we've got a rather strange situation here, because Washington did sanction Iran's oil shipping and banking industries last November. But since then, its seal of approval has been given to some organisations to actually take oil. So it's a little bit mucky. But the key point is, of course, it will not be the Israeli Navy that's got the power to carry out such a blockade. It would have to be the US. And this fits very nicely, because if you have a look at the moment, the Israel Defence Force Twitter page, one of the recent posts is the completion of Juniper Falcon exercise with the US and Israel. There's a little video clip with American and Israeli service personnel fawning over each other in the success of that operation. So Iran is looking at this and saying they're being attacked. We're seeing evidence that the British government is meddling in the affairs of overseas countries in a covert way. Could there be some truth in it? We think so. But follow it through, because of course the American power in the region is the US Central Command. And looking at their Twitter page, there's a little bit of furore come up over internally displaced persons. And Central Command is effectively saying, no, we're being above board, we're helping these people. But if you look at comments that people have posted, they're pretty hard. You're lying. If any of that's true, you wouldn't have denied access of the buses that arrived at the checkpoint between the border to evacuate the refugees from Rukban. So people are questioning what's being reported here. Should we trust what the US Central Command says? Well, we might just pop back to 2017 when CNN and other such media ran an article clearing CENTCOM leaders of, quote, cooking ISIS intelligence. And this followed an investigation which arose because whistleblowers inside the organisation were saying that intelligence was altered. Specifically, the claim was that commanders imposed a false narrative on an analyst, intentionally rewrote and suppressed intelligence products, and engaged in delay tactics. So that was falsifying information, but there was an investigation, and the investigation cleared it. Well, it cleared it because it said it was largely unsubstantiated. So we weren't told what the detail was, but the picture we get is the fact that major parts of American military in the Middle East were falsifying intelligence reports. And we say, to whose advantage? The military, Israel, deep state in America? We don't know.
But David, it looks like the Western powers at least have finally decided to turn their eye towards Iran in a more serious way.
It certainly does. And more generally, looking at the Reuters Foundation here, the Reuters Foundation, we use the skills, values and expertise of Thomson Reuters, the press, to run programs that trigger real change and empower people around the world. So is that not exactly what the Integrity Initiative has been accusing the Russians of? Precisely. Is that not exactly the charge against Russia Today and Sputnik? You know, but we're broadcasting it to the world and praising these organisations for doing exactly these things.
Well, I mean, this is a very good point, and of course, through the World Service, the BBC World Service, in particular, and particular programs of the World Service, that's something that we've been doing for decades. It's not something which is new to the post-truth world, David.
No, indeed, and this is the judgment that Brian described there of the case being largely unsubstantiated. This is another thing we're finding, that we have not seen people with sufficient independence of mind and sufficient discernment in positions of power to make reliable decisions. And this seems to be the norm now. So the whole system becomes extremely unreliable. Everything becomes ever more opaque. And post-truth, it's almost as though the postmodern vision, which is there's an infinite number of ways to interpret anything, and you can't know what's right or wrong under any given circumstances. All there is power. It's almost as though that has become the guiding principle.
Indeed. Now let's come back to the UK and free speech. And well, this tweet was pushed out by RIP Nutmeg today, a couple of days ago, and it says the editor of Oxford student newspaper resigns, saying all UK universities have become so obsessed with censoring free speech that having silenced the right, they're now going after the left, as if their opinion, steers slightly from the consensus. So this is the statement in the New Statesman by Freddie Hayward. And he says, people often think universities are places where your views are challenged, refined and improved. They are seen as places of debate and pluralism where beliefs are contested and scrutinised. Earlier this month, I wrote an article profiling Armin Navabi. Navabi is the founder of Atheist Republic, an organization that connects atheists across the globe. It promotes LGBTQ and women's rights and fights the persecution of atheists. The article outlined his views and life story. The piece was published in Cherwell, Oxford University's independent student newspaper, but it will not be published online. The reason given was that the piece may be considered offensive. It was with regret I've resigned today as profile editor for Cherwell. I believe a diverse range of views should be tolerated. This article does not incite hatred or violence towards other people. It merely scrutinises ideas. This freedom to interrogate ideas underpins many of the freedoms we're fortunate enough to enjoy today. Cherwell's decision, he goes on to say, not to upload the piece is symptomatic of broader malaise. There is an atmosphere at Oxford and at other universities that an argument is not made valid by its logic, evidence or reason. Rather, arguments are valid and therefore worth hearing if they conform to the current zeitgeist. So, David, I was interested in your thoughts on this. It is an issue. It doesn't really matter what the subject was that was censored, but it is something which is becoming increasingly apparent across the university network, and universities no longer seem to be the sort of birthplaces of dissent and activism.
No, ideas are very tightly controlled. We see this over and over. We see it in all the British universities. We see it in the United States and Canada. And there is no end to it. What the left is discovering here, and I've seen 2 or 3 examples, there's a piece on Vox as well, saying the same thing. There is no end to the assault on ideas. So the people on the left who were busy deplatforming the Conservatives, or anyone actually with really quite mild centrist opinions, who were demonized as Nazis and all the rest of it, they are now being targeted. There is no end to this. Right? There is no end point at all. It becomes more and more extreme. And as it becomes more extreme, more people are resisting. The right has learned how to resist. Right? And the left's going to have to learn this as well. You saw Chris Williamson apologise and then it was immediately suspended. He's going to have to learn not to apologise. He's going to have to learn that you stand up for your principles and you keep speaking what you believe to be the truth, because that alone is important. But the fight at universities over this is going to go on and on. There's such a head of steam built up against free speech, and there's such a craving attitude amongst the people who run the universities. There's a lot of repair work to be done.
David, isn't it the case, am I unfair in saying this, but if you look back over the last 20 or 30 years at the people that have campaigned for minority rights in various ways, whether it be for the disabled or LGBTQ or whatever it happens to be, we ultimately get to the point where the campaigners themselves end up being the target of the same type of techniques that they had used previously to try to promote their particular policy agenda. And that seems to be what we seem to have reached a point now where we've got to the point where everybody, no matter what their beliefs, is being attacked pretty much in the way that, certain sections were being attacked first, but it's now got to the point where everybody gets the same treatment.
Yes, I think that's very astute. That's what we're getting. We saw in the named person fight in Scotland a really diverse group of opinions coming together. The only thing they had in common is they believed in something. They had some intellectual ground in which to stand. And I think it's an attack on that. It's an attack on believing in anything. Well, the message is there is only power, and you will not speak to it.
Mm. Well, we picked up from recent discussions in Parliament that basically the state has to control the agenda, and if what you're saying doesn't agree with the state's control of the agenda, then you are going to be suppressed. This is the nub of it.
Okay, well, let's bring Tommy Robinson on screen then, because here's The Guardian. Tommy Robinson to face fresh contempt of court proceedings. In the article, sorry, I've got David on. I do apologise. The Attorney General Jeffrey Cox has decided it is in the public interest to bring further proceedings against the far-right activist whose real name is Stephen Yaxley Lennon. And David, I think the first thing you noticed was the media coverage basically echoed the government press release identically.
It was very strange media coverage because for the most part, it was word for word from this press release. And where it was quoting Tommy Robinson, it was doing so, it picked odd things that he said, because he said that it's, why have they waited 5 months? And that was picked up in the media. Now, the timing isn't really the big issue, right? He was also saying, no, they've dropped the charge that my conduct may have prejudiced the trial, which is surely the substantive issue. Now, I contacted the government, the Attorney General Press Office, and asked if I could get clarifications to what the charges actually were. I was told no, and I was directed to this statement. And I was also told that I shouldn't be talking about this case, where the Attorney General's encouraging people not to talk about the case in case they too are deemed to be guilty of contempt. So there seems to be an agenda against proper press scrutiny of what is a very important case in terms of press freedom, in terms of the right for free speech in the UK. This is an important case that we should all be interested in. And yet, essentially, when I asked one simple question, which is, what exactly are the charges? I was told to go away. I wasn't going to be told, and I better watch myself, or I could be held in contempt as well.
So that was a threat, was it?
Sounded like a threat.
Okay, well that's an interesting development, isn't it? But, well, look, let's just briefly have a look at what Geoffrey Cox said. After carefully considering the details of the case, I've concluded there are strong grounds to bring fresh contempt of court proceedings against Stephen Yaxley Lennon. But the other point that he made was that he had done this independently from government. I'm not certain whether that's the case, but look, David, we're going to talk a little bit more about this after the programme for the UK Column Extra segment. But what in your opinion is the likely outcome of this in terms of the public response to this?
Well, I think it's going to fall down in two categories. There will be people who will take a knee-jerk reaction against Tommy Robinson because of the press coverage, right? They'll say, oh, he's a racist, EDL, and he deserves to go to prison essentially indefinitely. And they won't care very much about things like the law, because that's the kind of atmosphere the press are trying to stoke. And some people are buying that. But I think the number of people who buy that's going to be a diminishing number, because when you start to look at the case and you start to ask any questions about how the state is behaving, then it starts to look completely different. And if they have dropped any charge that he actually prejudiced the trial and they're still trying to lock the man up, then the only thing that will do is make British justice a laughingstock across the free world, such as the free world as remains, and it will highlight that there is no liberty in Britain.
Okay,
which begs the question, why is that message being put across?
Okay, we will talk more about that in the after show segment, which is available to UK Column members now. Let's just bring Jeremy Wright on screen now, because of course he is the Secretary of State for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, and he was talking yesterday on the issue of video on demand and so on. He said the government will soon be publishing a white paper on online harms, which will set out expectations for companies, focusing mostly directly on those harms which present the gravest threat to user safety. But beyond the white paper, we must also make sure that our concept of broadcasting and our policies towards it recognises and reflect the growing impact of the digital world. Our regulation of broadcasters is widely appreciated, including by audiences, for its robustness and effectiveness, and it sets the framework for much of the cultural and economic benefit we so value. It provides crucial consumer protections, especially with regard to harmful and inaccurate content, which plays an important role in ensuring trust in our broadcasters. But for relatively new on-demand platforms, rules are in many areas not robust. But as more and more of our content and public conversations move online, we need robust and democratic frameworks to help find the right path. This is not a move against technology. This is a recognition that technology plays a huge part in our lives with all the good it brings, but it brings challenges too, and a responsive and responsible government must address them. That's what he has to say. So another day, and it seems another direction that the government is attempting to shut down free speech and debate. And of course, they've tried this before with the Authority for Television on Demand, who had made it pretty clear that they wanted to regulate the entire internet. This policy agenda hasn't gone away. Well, we're starting to see the government making noises in that direction once again. David.
The government's fine regulation of the content from the mainstream media that protects us all from fake news that he was praising there. I give you this is from the BBC this week. The Salisbury attack is evidence of a Russian weapon stockpile.
Excuse me?
This position is, that was the BBC headline. Salisbury attack is evidence of a Russian weapon stockpile. This is not credible. The idea that the quality of the BBC output is high and the quality of the alternative media output is low, and that the regulation, the state regulation, is effective, and the peer group regulation that the alternative media has is ineffective, is not a credible position.
So that would mean, David, that because I bought a pasty for my lunch probably 30 minutes ago, according to the BBC, I bought a pasty for my lunch. Therefore, there is a huge pasty dump in Plymouth somewhere.
That would seem to be the logical extension of that.
Yes. Okay. Well, that's quite some analysis.
Good stuff. Right, okay, we'll move on in 1 second, but just a reminder that if you like what we do and you'd like to support us, please get onto the community website, ukcolumn.org/community, and you can join us there. And of course, if you do that, you get access to the post-UK Column news discussion, which today will focus on free speech. Now, moving on to defence, and we pushed out a little video yesterday on Twitter, which began with Tony Blair, and was discussing the issue of defence union and these bilateral agreements that you're seeing building on screen at the moment. Now, I was quite surprised, perhaps, that in the comments on Facebook and other places when we posted this video, that most people were focused on Tony Blair himself rather than the point that was really trying to be made by the video. So it seems that perhaps Tony Blair is not the best person to have as a sort of hook.
Leader of the centrist party.
Yeah, but probably the best not person to have as a hook for your video, because in fact people really just want to see the man in prison, and they're not really looking at the rest of the message. But I mean, this was the key point. This is just a few of the bilateral defence agreement that exist between EU countries, which are outside of the EU. And one of the reasons that this fascinated me was because, if we look at the people that are campaigning against EU Defence Union, for example, Major General Julian Thompson here, and we look at the comments that he's making in this little video. He's talking about bilateral agreements. He says that he likes them because, of course, these are agreements that the British government wants to go into, and therefore they're not in a blanket agreement where we're told what we'll do as we're told. So, okay, I can see his point, but at the same time, the point of the little video was slightly different. And here's one of the real problems with this, with the Franco-British bilateral agreements already. We have the likes of this going on. So this is the Defence Committee that David Ellis and I visited on Tuesday. And this is one of their other inquiries, the future of anti-ship missile systems. And this was a joint inquiry, a joint parliamentary inquiry between the UK Defence Committee and their French equivalent. So we're already seeing joint parliamentary activities at work. But aside from that, it was this diagram from the EU which explains European Defence Union very clearly, which was the key problem. Because if we look at Theresa May's deal, we find, if we take the centre pillars in this document, so we've got 8 pillars here. It looks like the Pantheon in Rome. We've got 8 pillars here, which are the sort of main supports for European Defence Union. And if we take the first one, which is PESCO, well, of course, Theresa May's deal keeps us out of PESCO, but we will actually cooperate with it. We'll take part in it as we feel like. But all these other aspects of European Defence Union, CARD, EDF 2017 to 2020, CSDP, MFF, Common Strategic Culture, and so on. These things are all, we are partaking in all those things as part of Theresa May's Brexit deal. And of course, we've got core participation with NATO as being one of the pillars. And we've made the point regularly on this programme that Mogherini from the EU side and Stoltenberg from NATO side have been working extremely hard to make sure that that pillar is absolutely secure. But the key one is this one on the left, bilateral, multilateral cooperation among member states. And this is the key point that we're trying to make in the video yesterday, because these bilateral defence agreements form one of the key pillars of European Defence Union. And if you look in the document that Pantheon diagram came from, they make it clear that European Defence Union can only stand if every single one of those pillars is in place. And this is what makes it important. So while I understand Julian Thompson's position on why he would support the idea of bilateral defence agreements rather than an EU level defence union, because bilateral defence agreements are done on a supposedly a national sovereign basis. If the EU is then taking that network that we can see a part of on screen here at the moment, if they're taking that network and turning that into one of the key pillars of defence union, then there's a bit of a difficulty there, and it would be perhaps ill-advised of Julian Thompson and those types of campaigners to be promoting the idea of bilateral defence under those circumstances.
I think, Mike, you're being kind to General Thompson. We have to recognise that he is a mature gentleman. He does not see this level of deceit in politics, because the bilaterals are the formation of a net, and the overall net is the European defence union. That's what's coming. I don't think that he's got the ability to actually see into it with that level of analysis, but the analysis you've just given is correct. I think a lot more work is done to bring some of these senior officers effectively to the evidence and make them understand what's going on. They've got too much confidence in Westminster and the Lords and the system. They don't realise that it's been infiltrated, and as David has called it, we've now got a government of occupation in force.
Okay, David, let's go to Scotland now, and Stephen Sutherland.
Yes, more information on the Stephen Sutherland case. Now, the lady you see in this picture here, this is Caroline Isaac. She was the bar manager of the Bayview Hotel where Stephen was having a drink the night he disappeared. And she was talking to him, and she was absolutely convinced that he was fine. There was nothing up with him. He was certainly not suicidal. And when the police immediately started to state, even before the body was found, that it was suicide, she didn't believe them. She was convinced this couldn't be correct, having been one of the last people to talk to him and see him alive. And then she started getting information from other people in the community, and she reported it to the police. And she's here describing how that went. She says, when she called the police, she said, this time he told me that a man talking to her had told her that he knew where Stefan had died, and for reasons that she didn't understand, he wasn't telling the police. So I did. This time they came to interview me, and it seemed to me to be really intimidating. I felt that it felt to me that the cop talking to me just didn't want to know. He insisted it had been suicide. He said I could get into trouble for wasting police time. A couple of days later, 2 local detectives came in unannounced, and I felt their message was to shut my mouth and leave them to do their job. So an intimidation of witnesses by Police Scotland in Caithness. And this isn't the only case that she reports here, because later on she moved away. She was very disturbed by this, moved away from the immediate area, got a different job, but still in the general neighbourhood, and met someone else at that job who knew more about the case. So she reported this again. And this concerns what happened to Stefan. And basically the information was he was beaten to death. And again, there was intimidation and a disinterested approach from the police. So she's raising this. It obviously doesn't sit well with a very, very disturbing article.
Mm. Okay, well, of course, anybody wants to get more background to this, you have an article on the UK Column website on Stefan Sutherland. Remind us what the headline was on that.
It's Stefan Sutherland, the unanswered questions. And this is now getting on for 2 years old, and the questions remain unanswered.
Yes. Okay, and an organisation in Ireland that we came across as a result of the Doherty case, if people remember that one, was TUSLA, and this is the Irish Child Protection Organisation, right?
It is, yes, run by a Scottish gentleman from Aberdeen Council. That was his origin, Mr. McBride. And the previous head of this organisation was also a Scottish or British civil servant, and his background included being responsible for the schools in Dunblane at the time of the Dunblane massacre. It's an interesting organisation. Now, I just wanted a little word about this because we're getting a lot of information in from Ireland and from TUSLA about extremely bad practice, intimidation of parents, threats being made, and it's really just I want to make the point. I want to thank all of the people who are sending us information. A lot of the names that came up in the case with the Dohertys are coming up again. So we're recognising the names, the same individuals. It's very concerning the reports we're getting, and it's really just a thank you to the people who are sending in these reports and information about how TUSLA are conducting themselves. It's an area we'll come back to, but it's very concerning indeed. Okay,
now let's just briefly go to the Scottish coast, and the Scotsman here, the headline is Russian ship with vomit weapon spotted off Scottish coast.
There are moments, Mike, when you think that the world can't get any more stupid. Here we have Scotland's national newspaper, a broadsheet, a sensible and learned tome, yes, part of the Fourth Estate and one of the most ancient newspapers anywhere in the world. And I saw this headline, Russian ship with vomit weapon.
And you nearly vomited.
I was very surprised. Now, when I went back to screenshot it, you see here they had a little video running underneath it. And the first thing that came up was Vladimir Putin previously made no secret of the fact he's willing to use nukes. So I hope everyone seeing this is suitably afraid. And this Scotsman and Guardian journalist called Paris Gortawson, a beautiful Scottish name, who is, I think, Canadian, but lives in Edinburgh, has written this piece about the terrible Russians and their vomit weapon in the Moray Firth. I mean, the poor guys came in, they were sheltering from a storm in the North Sea, they were in international waters, and this comes in the press. It's very strange. Now, a couple of things worth noting. One was the reaction on Twitter and on the Scotsman's Own page in the comments section. It was wall-to-wall laughter. This is not working. This level of trying to stoke fear is manifestly failing. I did put up one of the quotes here, where Mr. Stuart Cowan and the Scotsman's comment page suggested that we invite them in for a drink. After all, we're not at war. Well, yes, indeed, this is true. We're not at war. But then the political reaction, it's not the public's reaction, which is to laugh their heads off. No, it's quite different. So here you see Stuart MacDonald, the SNP defence spokesman. He says the UK's Ministry of Defence is failing Scotland, allowing Russian Navy vessels sailing through our territorial waters at will to conduct provocative drills like this. This is making up. This is fake news, by the way. He's just making this stuff up. Sightings of this new class of Russian Navy vessel also underline why years of treating Russian threats as a joke are over. And it's unacceptable that it takes over 24 hours for the Royal Navy to respond to threats in Scottish waters from bases in the south coast of England. So we're bringing in the SNP whining into this. But he's building up, and he's constantly doing this, building up the nasty Russians. The nasty Russians have monkeyed with our independence campaign, and it's the SNP are very anti-Russian as well. It's strange. Everyone, all the political parties are doing the same thing. Now, I thought that was as ridiculous as it could get. And I went to screenshot it today and I went looking for the article, and lo and behold, they've doubled down. So this is today's article from the Scotsman. Again, that wasn't stupid enough. No. Now we're doing analysis. Russian ship near Scotland. How does the vomit weapon work? What kind of ship is she? Has she sailed near the UK waters before? So now we've got a heavyweight journalist doing analysis on the vomit weapon, right? So you're thinking, no, this is just getting beyond the joke. And then I don't know if you've got the slide, but it was, yes, you do. It's beautiful. The same day that the vomit weapon came in to our coastal waters, well, it seemed to have been deployed, because this was the headline: Baby Grace is sick on Nicola Sturgeon. So you see the nasty Russians, they're using the vomit weapon and they're targeting the First Minister. So we should all be afraid.
Yes. I'm not
am I allowed to be very naughty and say here that the truth is, as the UK column can actually share with our viewers and listeners today, that before Putin came to power, the seas were completely flat. But the real Russian weapon was to make the surface of the seas bumpy, and that caused the sickness.
Well, I mean, I was suggesting here that we're one step away from cartoons, right? Because the Russians, it's a vomit weapon, but I'm pretty sure the Russians are also up to the following.
Well, no, I think you're wrong. It's the British that are doing that, David, because we discovered on Tuesday at the Defence Committee meeting, Professor Robert Johnson was talking about brown noise. Brown noise is an energy weapon, a sound energy weapon, which is deployed on ships which are dealing with Somali pirates. And what it does is make you poo yourself if it hits you. So that's much closer to what you have on screen at the moment, I have to say.
Okay.
We're laughing, but of course this is a reflection of the pitiful state of the United Kingdom at the moment. Has this occurred because people are changing? Well, people are certainly changing, but of course this is the result of an imposed psychological agenda. And the British government, of course, boasts of having its own nudge team to reframe the population. So let's get serious. We'll bring Gavin Williamson in. I don't know whether he's going to put in a bid for a vomit weapon. But the Independent here, Defence Secretary Gavin Williamson says military ready to respond to knife crime crisis. So we can't get ships to sea. We can't respond to Russian ships off the Scottish coast. But now the military are going to deal with knife crime that, of course, has been allowed to fester and increase due to a British government policy to enable it to do just that. But it gets worse. Cressida Dick, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, said she would be willing to bring in troops to support her officers as they battle a spate of stabbings. So how is she going to do that? Are we going to have military patrols on the London streets, or are we going to put troops on the underground? It's very difficult to know, particularly as we haven't got enough troops to defend the country. But I'm sure Cressida, as a common purpose future leader, will be able to sort that out quite quickly. Now, back to the state of the nation. And Mike, yesterday you gave a very good breakdown of what had been taking place in Westminster with intelligence analyst Chris Donnelly from the Institute of Statecraft explaining the dangers of Russian expertise in the game Go at the Westminster Defence Committee hearing. And this is a real picture. We haven't created this in the UK column. This is Westminster TV showing Chris Donnelly explaining the game Go to the Westminster Defence Committee because he says the Russians are very good at it. Well, we've got a UK column exclusive, and that is that there's been a response from Gavin Williamson. He says that following Institute of Statecraft's Chris Donnelly's recent shocking exposure that the Russians are using Go strategy to conduct hybrid warfare, and since we already know that they're masters of chess, I'm taking the immediate step of banning both board games in UK. And calling for an international moratorium on all board games. So Gavin Williamson is taking Go very seriously, and those board games are going to go. Claims that all Go and chess sets currently in the UK will need to be registered are completely untrue, but I can assure the general public that we'll consider all necessary steps to protect our country from hybrid warfare of any type, and some form of voluntary monitoring of the number and type of these boards in UK may possibly be necessary at some time in the future. So he's saying that there's been a bit of fake news. I would add that we're particularly concerned about the impact of Russian 3D chess, but monopoly will be permitted in order to ensure that we train future generations in banking fraud and financial support for munitions and war. Well, that is the humour. It's pretty black. Let's get into the reality of what Gavin Williamson and Secretary of State are up to. Here's a little bit more about Chris Donnelly. And one of the things that we got interested in was that he was previously a trustee of the London-based charity Active Change Foundation. He's also involved with another one called Forward Thinking. Let's have a look at Active Change. Here's the funders, donors and partners, and interestingly we see Institute for Statecraft there. We've got a lot of interesting people. We've got Boots involved and Barclays, a lot of local councils, Islington, Metropolitan Police are in there somewhere, all working to prevent violent crime and extremism. Well, we were fascinated to have a look at the team. Here's Chris Donnelly. Doesn't look quite as young as the photo there, but we also picked up on this gentleman, the chief executive from this charity. And why were we interested in this man? Well, let's have a look at what they say about Hanif Qadir. They say a former foreign fighter himself, Hanif, once joined Al-Qaeda members in Afghanistan, but was deterred by the crimes he saw being committed against civilians and turned his back on them. Upon his return to the UK, he vowed to safeguard young men and women from serial experience. So we've got an Al-Qaeda terrorist who simply decides he's going to come back into Britain and help teach the UK government how to stop violent crime. But we've just heard that violent crime, including knife crime, is on the increase. Is there any connection? I mean, who knows? But here we've got a terrorist, Al-Qaeda terrorist, coming back into the country, and we'd like to ask the question, how does this happen? Let's remember this young lady, because there's a huge furore that a teenager who clearly went off the rails, we don't know whether we can allow back in because she's been associated with ISIS. Saved Javid has this to say: my message is clear. If you've supported terrorist organisations abroad, I will not hesitate to prevent your return. So we've got a rather strange situation where the young girl who we can say, yes, has been involved with terrorists, she wants to come back in the country, but we don't really want her. But we've got this gentleman who was an Al-Qaeda terrorist who is freely operating, and he seems to be operating alongside another man supposedly advising the government about how to deal with terrorism, hybrid warfare, and of course, dangerous board games like Go. So I'll just add the other charity. This is it, Forward Thinking. Here's Chris Donnelly with that. And we've got some fantastic people involved with this, because we've got men who were working alongside Tony Blair. We've got people who were advising Her Majesty's ambassador to the Holy See. We've got a Deputy High Commissioner in Pakistan. This is all one man, Francis Campbell. My question is, who are these people? David, we've got a mixture of cartoon conduct of politics and important issues like crime in the country. But behind the scenes, we've got people, we have no idea who these people are, what their morality, their views, values, and allegiances, and they are forming policy. How does this work?
This, I think, is called the European model. I came across this recently in Scotland as part of the LGBT education in schools campaign that the government's pushing forward. And it all came from a report that was like 3-4 years old. It sat on the shelf in the government. And all of a sudden it was suddenly policy. So I went to see who the authors were. And it said on the front cover of the report, it said, this is entirely our own work. This is the authors take responsibility for everything that's in here. And not government. But I couldn't find the names. It was entirely anonymous. So I contacted the Scottish Government and asked who had written this report, which was now setting policy. And I was told I was not going to get that information. It was secret. So we're having people, I don't know who these people are. Are they activists? Do they have some sort of agenda? What are their political views? I've no idea. But it's now setting government policy. And we see this everywhere. Government policy comes from these obscure sources. And no one can question what the worldview is, what the agenda is, what are they trying to achieve. It's all secret.
It's all secret. And that ties in very nicely with your description of the fact that we actually have at the moment a government of occupation. We'll have to leave it there. We're coming up for time now. But I think we do need to investigate that term, because it does seem to be very accurate. This is not a government of British people for the British people. This seems to be a completely different government with a completely different agenda. We'll leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us. Remember, if you'd like to support the UK column with a donation or a subscription, we need your financial support to do what we do. Thanks.
Well, let's just also just mention Lynn once again. If you're able to get to the Royal Courts of Justice on Tuesday to support Lynn in her fight against extradition to France for on the GC MAF issue, then please do get along to that. We'll also make another reminder on Monday.
Yeah, because we do know that people attending court make a big difference. Make a big difference, because obviously the eyes are on the people in the court to see justice being done. Thanks very much for joining us. We'll be back at the same time on Monday. Bye-bye.